God's fourth dimension white light, God's fourth dimension white light, God's fourth dimension white light, God's fourth dimension white light. Repent, 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 AI, American AI. Repent, American AI. Repent, American AI. Repent, American AI. God's fourth dimension white light, God's fourth dimension white light, God's fourth dimension white light. God's fourth dimension white light, 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 God's fourth dimension light white. God's fourth dimension white light, 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 God's penetrating 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 fourth dimension white light.